the comic book in Australia is a very important part of our past and, indeed, our present. What about our future? We're going to find out as we introduce the curator of the Australian Comicbook Exhibition, Annette Shiel, who's with us. Annette, welcome. Pardon me. You pronounce it Shiel, don't you?
That's right.
Annette, this is a fascinating exhibition. Tell us how it's got underway.
Well, it is a terrific exhibition. It's a joint exhibition produced by Monash University, the National Centre for Australian Studies, and the Ephemera Society of Australia. And it's looking at 60 years of Australian comic book history.
And were you into comic books before this came along?
No, I wasn't. People have asked me that, but no, it's not one of my own fetishes. But as a curator, it's been a tremendous project to work on. Very.
Of course, it doesn't have to be a fetish. I mean, it can be just an interest, can't it?
Yes, there certainly are a lot of collectors out there, and comic books are growing in interest.
Yeah. The first comic book in Australia, I can recall because I happened to work on a movie about it. Fatty Finn, I'm sure that was the first Australian comic, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Fatty Finn's Weekly in 1934. And it was a little bit different to perhaps comics that the viewers would remember. It was a larger format, tabloid style, a British-style comic.
Yeah, almost like the Sydney Morning Herald or
That's
Age
right.
newspaper.
Yes, that's exactly right, yes.
And have there been quiet moments in the industry in Australia? I would imagine during the Second World War, now there were British and American comics coming over, but I don't think, was there much local Australian product during the Second World War?
Actually, the onset of the Second World War stimulated the birth of our Australian comic book industry,
right.
because there were bans on the import of the American material, and during that time up to 30 publishers emerged.
Right, what sort of stuff, what sort of material?
Oh, a range of material. Of the smaller American-style comics, which people would associate as a comic book today, there was adventure stories, war stories, just the full gamut. There was Australia's sort of own material.
Yeah, basically Australian versions of superheroes from overseas?
Yes, there was that strain, but there was also quite an indigenous form of material too, like Trent of the Territory, and those sorts of characters.
And of course I suddenly realised too, I mean, I'm totally wrong, because it was during the Second World War that a lot of our comic strip characters went into comic books, didn't they? Bluey and Curly and Ben Boyang, and they'd be considered comic books, wouldn't they?
Yes, well, we have included them in our exhibition if they came out in annuals. So we're not looking at strips as such, but the ones that you've mentioned, Bluey and Curly, Ginger Megs, Fatty Finn, that came out in annuals, we've included in the exhibition.
Tell us something about the exhibition in terms of numbers and the range that you offer.
Oh, look, it's a very interesting exhibition. As we've talked about, it looks at the full range from the past, present and future. So it's 60 years. We look at various themes, censorship, the role of women, costume crusaders, the superheroes that we've mentioned, beyond the comic book, merchandising, getting into film, as we've talked about Fatty Finn. The Kids' Stakes, a very early silent film. We also look at our contemporary industry, and there are comics there for the viewers to come in and look at and read. So our comic industry now really is having quite an explosion.
I don't think it was during the Second World War, but just after the Second World War, I can recall that most of the heavies, most of the villains in comics that I read were either Germanic or they were Japanese.
Yes, that's right. That's been a fascinating thing to look at through the history. Our social history comes out very clearly in the comics, and we can, as you say, sort of match the baddies to who Australia was at war at. Yeah. Initially it was the Germans, we were fighting the Nazis, and, in quotes, the Japs, and then the Koreans. Yeah,
that would have had to have changed, though, I think, even as far away as the late 40s and early 50s, suddenly realised that it wasn't the done thing, and that sort of sifted out, didn't it?
It did sift a bit, but it still was a prevalent theme coming through those adventure comics. Now I suppose the baddies really are more sort of technology, science fiction.
And generic.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Right. You've got a couple of examples here. You've got the Fatty Finn one, which is just beautiful. There you go. What's the story on this one? Would that be worth a lot of money?
That's not in terrific condition, that one. You can see it's a little bit tatty, but yes, they can range from, $5 to $200.
We have a segment actually today. Bruce Mansfield is coming in for the first segment for the year, and he and his friend Rick Milne, and Rick is a particular expert in areas of ephemera. Some comic books, I think that he's negotiated figures like, I don't know, $400, $500, $600, $1,000.
Yes, look, that would be right, and that's probably for the American ones.
Yes, yeah.
That one that you've got in your hand actually is a terrific example of the baddies. If we look at the front cover there, you can pinpoint the baddies not only by their deeds but by their physical appearance. I'm sure people can see on that one, who are the baddies, those more sinister looking men.
Nice to see your dad working, John. So there you go. Phil, if you're watching, just a little joke there, you understand. Trent of the Territory, Australian Adventure Comics by Jolliffe. Now, Jolliffe was also responsible for a cartoon in the Australian Post, I think it was, which basically was around an Aboriginal tribe, and that wouldn't be allowed in the 90s. But Jolliffe, do you know much about him as a cartoonist?
Yes, his early work here, which we're looking at, Trent of the Territory, is very interesting, and he was very good at portraying the Australian landscape and the characters very accurately. He actually went out and lived amongst the Aboriginal people, and his drawings and comic books are very sympathetic.
Right. Just two to go. Could you pass them over?
Yes,
We've got a larger table now, and I've got a smaller arm, I think. This is Greener Pastures. I've never heard of that.
This is one of our very new comics, 1994 this one was produced, and it follows the adventures of Trevor Bovis, or Trevor the Bull, who gets sick of being on the land and stands up on his hind legs and goes to university. But running through that entire comic, which is a very humorous one, are issues about the plight of farmers, the environment, animal liberation, and that's very clearly set in Australia. Cucumgilligan, New South Wales.
Did you see that again?
Starting point.
I think my mother-in-law may have modelled for that. Now, the reason I mention that is just to give her equal time, so the pressure will go up for mentioning it to Phil.
Thanks, Bert. That's
and this one, more recent?
That's the Southern Squadron that comes out of a team in South Australia, and that's one of our very own superhero teams. But perhaps most interestingly out of that is the leader is Lieutenant Smith, and that is the woman. And the rather hairy character known as the Dingo is actually, in its alter ego form, a Serbian by the name of Kostas.
Right. Well, it sounds like a fascinating exhibition. I suppose the more recent comics will be seen out there too,
Yes,
the ones
will.
you talked about this morning. Now, it's at Waverley, at the gallery there?
Yes, at the Waverley City Gallery in Wheelers Hill at the moment, and it's also in Launceston.
Right. So there are two exhibitions, as we mentioned. There's one national one, is there, and one which is
And
local.
one Victorian one.
Right.
And they'll be travelling for 2 years, and the exhibition will be seen throughout Australia over the next 2 years.
And it's called the Australian Comicbook Exhibition.
ACE.
ACE, right, I got you. Nice to meet you, and
Thank you
I
very
hope
much.
the tour continues with great success.
Good,
Thank
thank you.
Annette Shiel, curator of the Australian Comicbook Exhibition.